This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, being recorded now. Thanks for having me. And apologies to Australian folks that might be online that might do a bit of this talk before. It's a bit of an evolving feast at the moment because it's work in progress. So I was adding a slide just before the talk. This is things changing all the time. So you'll see mistakes in here, work in progress. So just presenting some of the ways we're using controlled vocabularies, the standardized world data, and the challenges that we encounter and at present how our current solutions for solving those problems. Now, here we go. So our role at 30 Federation University in this regard, talking about soil data is primarily as soil brokers. We develop data sharing platforms and tooling. We're users of controlled vocabulary. We see ourselves as primarily users, and where necessary, we are creators and managers. So what we use vocabulary for,
Megan? Sorry to break in. We're having a little bit of trouble with your audio. Is there a mic or some way that you could possibly clean it up a little bit?
I don't have a better mic, but if I try and speak up and move the computer a little closer, I'll try. Let's jump in again. Sorry if I'm still not loud. So we're using controlled vocabulary to standardise soil data. Obviously, so data comes in mostly from farmer grower groups and catchment management authorities. So we receive data mostly as Excel sheets and sometimes database dumps, and the content is in no standard structure. The results come from laboratories across Australia, and the results generally aren't described in standard ways, and where they are described in standard ways is national standards. They are not available as controlled vocabularies often, and data comes in with very little contextual data fields. So the focus of this presentation is how we're applying controlled vocabularies to help standardise this data and the challenges that we're encountering and current approaches. And as I said, this is in development. So the work here is contributing to a number of soil data related soil data delivery projects. Principally at the moment is the soil CRC project. So data coming in from soil CRC providers, principally farming groups and catchment management authorities, rather than research data at the moment. We're delivering data through soil data through the Agriculture Research Federation in a standardised way, and as well as to knowledge bases for catchment management authorities. So the focus here really is the work that's happening in BAS, the Soil CRC project, and just briefly, that's an interoperable spatial knowledge system with a range of CRC participants. But as I said, the data we're dealing with in this first phase is grower groups and catchment management authority data, and that's a list of the providers there. So they come from all around the country, and they use a whole bunch of different laboratories to get their results. So some social research has been done with these providers to find out what their data user and provider requirements were. And these are just some key themes that came out of that. So search and discovery for on-farm decision making, seeing trends across time and space. That's a big one. So graphically representing that and being able to pull out reports as well. And to view data in context with other data at the local, regional, national level. So in terms of communication, they like to be able to search and discover to help them get big pictures of farming activities in the region, connecting to other projects, avoiding duplication, using for funding applications, potentially banking, insurance. They're concerned about their data that's shared. Will it be described properly? So will others understand its context when it's out there? And issues around privacy, trust and security always come up. The transfer of knowledge between staff members is also an issue. There's a lot of soil knowledge within some groups, and when staff move on, being able to pass on that knowledge. So this is just a high-level overview of how that works. The contributors hand over their data in whatever form it is for us to play with at the moment. So we don't have a user interface. It undergoes an initial assessment, and sometimes it goes back to the provider if we need more information, and we map it to observation measurement schema, describe it with standard terms, and then go through a bit of internal review process and load it into the system and then back to the providers to review. And as well as data coming into the database, observation measurement schema, we are bringing in data from other sources as complementary, such as climate data, and a number of web applications are being developed or will be developed. So with a focus on vocabularies, I've tried, don't look too closely at this, but it's just a kind of picture of where within our database where we're using vocabulary terms. So we've got vocabulary term tables there. So we've got observations that come in from the providers, and they come in as measured values or text descriptions for asserted values. So where we have an asserted value, we use classifiers. So the classifiers need to be represented as standard vocabulary terms, so they're in the vocab table. Often they don't say what the specimen is, so that's kind of, you know, we map to the observations as features of interest. And features of interest do have vocabulary terms, spatial sampling features, so what is sampled, spatially has a vocabulary term as well. And then we relate those features to each other over space and time using describing the relationship type and the relationship roles. So the role of the target and those roles of between features, between soil features, features of interest and spatial features are kept in the vocabulary tables as well. Yeah, so specimen type, as I say, we don't really get that. The labs, the providers don't really provide that information. The observed property of the observation. So that's in the vocabulary term table as well. And the procedures is a big one. So we try to create control vocabulary for the procedures. Most of the time that does need to be created. And we have some contextual some project information. I haven't gone into much detail there, but just a couple, not using control vocabulary much there at all. Mostly, I think, just the organisation type and the commodities. Commodities just soil at this point, and the units of measure. So here's just a quick visualisation of. Now this is changing all the time, so this is, well, however many weeks old. So you know, a month has changed because actually the door on this is this month. So so you click on the samples there, and you can see. Next slide might say something. Yeah. So in the results, you can see the observed property, so what is being observed, which should go after control vocabulary, the procedure that is used to make that observation. Goes to a control vocab, unit of measure, control vocab, and the result. So yeah, well, here's just an example of what, when you click, it should go through to the control vocabulary. So I said this is a little outdated. You've got the unit, the procedure used, which is actually a standard procedure, or almost standard procedure here, and the observed property. So the functionality, reporting, etc., is being developed at the moment. So working on trends across time and at depth. So advanced filtering, reporting, and downloading options. I don't know if I did mention actually the two main different types of soil data coming in at the moment. I guess you'd say observations at depth. So say 0 to 10, and observations of soil profiles. So we're only really just starting to work on soil profiles, trying to map in soil profile data at the moment. So that's early work. Some challenges you could see here if you look too closely at the interface, we jostle about this. We have to balance the needs of what the grower groups want with what the scientists are happy to see, the scientists in the CRC, the scientists within our group, and also from the informatics and information point of view, you know, are our labels correct here? So samples, for example, well, they're not the samples, they're the soil layers. So yeah, that's a feature of interest. Does the farmer know what feature? Do they want to see feature of interest as their label? Probably not. They probably want to see samples. So what we jostle about with that. Same with, you know, we've got soil organic carbon there, percent, and we go, oh, what's soil organic carbon? Is that your method? Is that the thing that you're measuring? What if I want to see it in ppm? So we play with pulling those concepts apart and working, just trying to get that interface right for a bunch of formulas. So here are some of the vocabularies we use. So for feature types, features of interest and spatial sampling features, we're using the INSPIRE term. Yeah, well, how we interpret the INSPIRE term for application. Our application is a little bit interesting. We move around a little bit there and we notice a bit of difference in how people, different groups are perhaps applying the terms, like we're applying soil body a little differently to what others are when recently we get paddock data, you know, paddock data in. So we're like, oh, is that a soil site? Is it a soil plot? So yeah, applying those feature vocabularies is a little bit of a challenge for us. The relationship type role vocabularies, we're using relationship ontology. Some of those are a little challenging to interpret and select, and are a little bit, you'd hope the user would never have to see those definitions, but yeah, applying them is a little bit of a challenge. Sampling methods I've found, and you guys can probably we'll get lots of feedback here, hopefully, or flick us a message, but I find the sampling methods a little hard to find and interpret. There's one thesaurus there we're using, and yeah, this is, I guess, the broader question or thing we encounter is that you've got concepts sitting in a collection, so it says procedures, but then when you read the description, you go, oh, is that a procedure? I don't know. So yeah, do you go by straight what the concept and definition says, or because something's sitting in a collection and it says it's a procedure, do you go, right, that's a procedure? So we run into that quite a bit. Vocabulary selections are a challenge for us, probably similar to lots of people. So how do we know that it's persistent and trusted, that it's actively governed and preferably by an authoritative body? So at the moment, we're just making best judgment calls that appear to be formalised, versioned, governed. We try to avoid project-specific vocabularies where possible, such as this one's from the Soil IE experiment. And so we've got some general rules. So preferably it has a definition, and the definition describes what you want it to or how you're applying it. So it is actually describing what you are trying to describe. So if you want an observed property that should come from a collection that says something like properties, a substance should be from a collection of substances or objects or something like that. So yeah, and the next point, as I said before, so well, it's the context, so where it sits in the hierarchy. So we find that we just have to flip back through and make sure that it makes sense when we select our terms. So, for example, respiration. If it's got a definition that it's the process of plants generating CO2, then we don't apply that because we're trying to describe what microbes are doing. So a lot of the terms we're finding are plant specific. I don't know if this is valid or not, but I see if it's reused a lot by other ontologies, or perhaps that says something about how reputable and well governed the term is. I don't know if that's debatable. And maybe it increases the chance of our data being able to be linked with other data into the future. So look for machine readable human definition as well as machine readable. And as a vocabulary beginner, I was guilty of like just not getting the source URI. Just when you're learning, putting the web address as the vocabulary in the browser and things of the search engine and things like that. So just making sure you get the persistent URI. So I've kind of whittled it down to spending hours and hours searching around all over the shop just to go, oh, these search services are really useful. So I just go, actually, this is not a good ad for agro portal, is it? I couldn't, it was down when I tried to get the symbol for this. So, yeah, so just kind of 3-step, or 4-step actually. So you've got the agri-semantic, MAP, OLS, agro portal and bioportal. Pretty good, so just get through those and those features in the Inspire registry. And I know there's terms sitting in a bunch of terms over ISO, but I don't really, I find that a bit patchy. It's probably a lack of time as well as just not really knowing if they can are out there as controlled vocabularies and where to find those, and we should be applying those. Yeah, so we use a fair few vocabularies which aren't stable at the moment. They're experimental, that were created a while back. So we're going, well, we probably should get out there and look for the persistent version of it that's governed. So you end up kind of like when I was looking for ammonium concentration. Well, here's one concentration of ammonium in soil. Well, that's in what phenotype and trait ontology do you really need in soil? I don't know. It's like looking for a concentration of ammonium vocabulary out there that's stable. So I don't know the answer to this one. You guys could probably tell me. So when I'm looking for, so here's one, we've got sulfur concentration in a vocabulary in a collection, and the unit is milligrams per litre, and we want to use it with the unit of measure ppm or something like that. So you go, oh, is that actually part of that concept, or is that independent? Like, can I still use that while that milligrams per litre is sitting in there? Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. So challenges continue for observable properties. There's plenty of them. So I go, I'm looking for the observed property, carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? So it's sitting in a property collection. That should be okay. Plant available water. Like, oh, is that the observed property of plant available water? It's sitting in physical objects. So can I use that to describe the observed properties? Yeah, I don't know. I found that observed properties for soil are kind of scattered everywhere. So there's just a grab shot of some of them. I think probably most of them, and species and substances objects are the same. They're sitting across a bunch of different ontologies and collections. We've been doing some mapping of soil biology just in the last week. So we found the soil process terms to describe soil process relating to living things in the soil are across a bunch of different ontologies as well. We've found the interlinking ontology for biological concepts quite useful, and then they're scattered across other ontologies out there. So, yeah, describing the soil biological stuff has been really interesting. Interesting to me. Luckily, my PhD was in soil microbial ecology, so it's not too bad, but it's also a bit baffling. So I guess that raises questions about, which it does for us all the time. It's like you got your specific domain within the soil, and it takes some domain knowledge, or some domain knowledge helps to be able to do these mappings. But you know, how do you have all those individuals? You know, where's the compromise? But anyway, so here's yeah. So this is the soil biology mapping, and over on the left there's that's the provider label, and we're finding that they can be really abstract, like unclear. We don't really know what they're actually measuring. They use a lot of proxies and indicators. So when you're picking an observed, we're having to create the method. We're putting in as much information as the provider gives us to create the controlled vocabulary procedure. But when you go to map it to an observed property, you're like, what is the observed property? So you can see they've got P mineralisation, N mineralisation. So you think, oh, observed property, N mineralisation. Then you read the method and you go, oh, they're measuring carbon dioxide, and then they're doing a bunch of calculations to get N mineralisation. So what observed property do you use there? N mineralisation or something else? So I've just gone, part of this was me trying to be not incorrect, but also it kind of gets pretty tedious, to be honest. You don't want to be making up all these bizarre observed properties that no one's ever going to reuse. So I've just gone, anaerobic respiration. There we go. And what's being measured? Carbon dioxide. So you could argue, oh, what's best for the provider? So for the farmer, do they want to see microbial activity or a microbial activity indicator? Well, what's the substance there? Oh, I don't know. It's really hard for the proxies and indicators.
You know, Megan, do you want to take questions as you fly along? Yeah, could you go back to that slide?
Oh yeah, well, yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I would say that your observable property from a data perspective would be mass concentrations. You know, you've got milligrams of some substance per kilogram of something else. I would imagine that's often, you know, so it's resulting from perhaps from some type of respiratory activity. But if you're thinking about a use case of researchers looking for data, they're probably looking for, you know, mass concentrations of carbon dioxide, or, you know, mass concentrations of organic carbon, or something like that. So this is, you know, part of the complication of doing ontologies, is at what level you want to describe them at. You can, of course, describe them at different levels and let people discover things through a query for respiratory processes, or for something like, I'm just really interested in carbon content of the soil. So that would just be my one comment there. Because I was looking at observable property and thinking, oh, well, you know, we would model those as mass concentrations.
Yeah. And maybe that's a bit of a database limitation as well, of that we can't store multiple observed properties. So yeah, we did flick around with where we're not using concentrations or mass concentrations generally, but I did start using the biological stuff. Oh, when you've got a microbial community and they do some calculations on that to get some indicator, we're saying, well, is there a property? We're just saying composition at the moment.
Well, you have another predicate,
actually, feedback good, or we're saying biomass of. Yeah.
This is a little bit of a limitation, I think, of SOSA and a lot of these observation and measurement models, which are really about the measurement. Whereas, it's not really a measurement of anaerobic respiration. It's a measurement of a mass concentration. You could have another predicate that says something like resulting from anaerobic, so you axiomatize it. It's not necessarily something you'd express fully in the SOSA model. You'd express it through some other predicates. That's the way my offhand way of thinking how to model around this dilemma you're having.
So it also seems like you've got these being secondary calculations where the providers have done some kind of type of conversion ratio between, say, nitrogen and respired CO2. And it would be really nice to figure out a way to represent that in a data structure so that you've got those assumptions and those conversion factors that they decided was appropriate for their data for whatever reason.
Couldn't they be treated as observation results with, where there's one observation is related, so your base observation is milligram, you're measuring the mass concentration, but there's an observation result that's about anaerobic respiration that's a related observation.
Yeah, that's right. It's tricky. It's kind of knowing where to stop, and then you do have the limitations of your system and timelines and things like that. So, but interesting from an ontological discussion perspective. So,
because Steve, you could also say that was a provenance thing, right? That measurement resulted or was derived from an anaerobic respiratory event. So there are different ways to model it for sure. Yeah.
And it's always the prerogative of the data provider for what level of detail they choose to provide. And it's up to the data consumer to decide whether that's enough for them.
Yeah, that's right. Because we've got farmer grower groups, we don't have researchers yet. So, but we're just making calls along the whole way, really. So here's an example. So a bunch of column headers. These are from the one data set, and these were the column headers. So the question is exactly sort of the results. What process is being measured? They provided no standard or citable method. Do they have one? That takes time going back. So which compound's being measured? How, what's the degree of resolution, accuracy you need to get to? So it can come down to the expertise of the data manager who's working on the project as well. We've all got our different expertise. And and they're not related. These things aren't related to each other in soil ontology, so they might be. I imagine there's probably a carbon one out there. So that's a question for you guys. But so when you go, oh well, what's the phosphorus thing? What's the object we're measuring? Oh, I know it's not ideal, but we're just saying phosphorus atoms because we just have to go. Well, just a call for now. So when we do need to create vocabularies, we're using the CSIRO linked data registry, and at the moment using Excel to LDR upload tool. We only create concepts that aren't listed elsewhere, but how do you know you're not missing them? I'm always asking myself that. Most of the time we're creating classifiers as results. And getting soil, there's one missing here, it's just, soil chemical procedures. We're always getting up procedures, and we need to get up the, help get up the soil chemical procedures as well, standard Australian procedures. So considerations that we're finding are upskilling, time and effort, the main skills I mentioned, and you've got that conflict, which you probably all experience sitting in an academic institution of service work fee academic outputs and how do you do them both together. But the VRI is unique, and the approach that the prefix reflects the governance arrangement. And so when you're getting a vocab up, you run into questions of governance. So whose role is it to govern and create and maintain and govern into the future? So you have discussions around institutional priorities, roles, responsibilities, resourcing, etc., and the roles of national bodies, the IP holders, the global soil community, generalist community, individual organisations that have their own classifiers, for example, like a soil laboratory. So yeah, and we've been so just working with trialing tools like Excel to LDR that makes vocab creation lightweight, low bar for non-semantic experts. Good that Simon's on the call, so thank you, Simon, for this. Simon alerted us to that we should be using the most current version of QUDT. So we try to map to units as provided, and if we need to push out some, if the users want to see it in a different unit of measurement, that we'll do the conversions on the fly. Some don't provide units of measure, which is a real pain, and a bit of a time waste, so you've got to go back down the chain to the provider. And we don't ever create our own units of measure. So we've been, we look for the units of measure now in this version of QUDT, and we've just got to replace all that term in our database with these, of our vocabulary table. We found a few of the soil units not up, available as controlled vocabularies, and Simon pointed out that this has been managed primarily through GitHub, so you can put pull requests up for units of measure you might notice are missing. So yeah, Simon's helped out. He put kilograms per hectare up there, and I found that the quantity kinds for volume fractions weren't up there, which we used. So weight per weight, percentage weight per weight, etc. And we're finding a lot of labs use, this was an interesting discussion, that they're still using millet equivalents per 100 grams instead of centimole per kilogram. So, well, how do you, that's not up there. So the term equivalent has gone up, and then milli equivalent per 100 grams has to be built. However, the Cleveron told us to do that. And I pushed up a request for centimole per kilogram as well. So I guess it's just flagging that that's out there for people that might not be aware. We needed to get so in Australia, most of the soil chemical methods that are commonly used are in the green book, it's called, and the descriptions for soil profile are in the yellow book. So Simon and Linda worked hard to transform the yellow book into a representation controlled vocabulary, and they helped us out with starting to get up the green book as well. And you'd note there that the URI, so it goes down to reflect the governance arrangement. So the register is Australian vocabularies, and then you go down to, it reflects the governance arrangement. So you've got the yellow book there, which is in the domain of the National Committee on Soils and Terrain. Then you've got the soil chemical methods, which that comes up with governance discussions that are happening at the moment. So that will be a different group, we imagine, governing that and any changes to that into the future. Then we created a register EDU, and that's where we're popping and creating Federation University vocab at the moment. So, oh my gosh, soil chemical procedures are just a nightmare. Oh, how this all started was that we were putting, we didn't have an O&M kind of, we didn't have procedures with our units of measure, etc. in an old database that we were using. So we were just getting procedure after procedure after procedure after procedure that we were trying to manage and map to. So that's what kind of prompted part of the shift to this database design. But we're still finding the procedures are just like a growing nightmare. So some of the things we run into, you've got the import term is what the data provider provided. So 7C1 and 7C2. Well, that tells us it could be either method, which is not very helpful. You've got to go back to them. And they told us what it was. We made the call to stick the species at the end of the procedure method, which was a bit of a hang up from previous systems, but also we're actually finding quite useful, particularly when you've got one method and then you've got a bunch of calculations on top of that to give it your result. And as you were talking about before, you know, is that actually two things that should be represented separately? Oh, we don't know, but for now, we've got the what's being measured kind of on the end of the procedure in most cases.
Do you have any of the sort of the methods interrelated at all? So say 7C1 is 50% concentration of 7C2, but otherwise the protocol is the same. So there's some similarity between some of them.
Yeah, we are aware that we could do that quite easily. That's just been a matter of priority of we've just kept it really simple, we've just got flat at the moment. Okay. But we do know, you know, given a bit of spare time, we could quite easily say this is, you know, related to or something like that. We've got we can do that. The tooling helps us to do that. But yeah, sometimes we have to go to a really generic code, which is not very helpful. Like that, we don't know if it's 4B1 or 4B2, so we just have to go one level up and say it's the calcium chloride method. Sometimes in this example, we've got example 2, a bunch of carbon methods. We don't know how to differentiate them. So we have to go back to the provider and they told us it's 3 different standard methods from the Green Book. But you don't always get those answers. I won't go into it too much really, but the top one is just saying the calculations are an issue of like cation exchange capacity, EC. We said we'd import them as CEC, EC, and we'll create a procedure. We're finding that that's problematic because you can't always tell what that the labs have done. Their interpretation of EC and CEC is different, so it's a bit problematic. Perhaps that was the option of just import, and we've still got the option of just using the raw values and calculating those things on the fly, CEC, etc. We get entirely example 4. That's just an entirely new method. A method that's outside the standard. Example 5 is just we kind of created an extension of the Green Book, so that raises questions around how are extensions managed and considered by the soil community or the Green Book community. Yeah, and again, should we be stating the relationships between them?
Early on, you mentioned that you were getting a lot of spreadsheets, and boy, I know what a pain in the neck that can be. And so my question is, did you then harmonize? Did you actually take those heterogeneous spreadsheets and basically put them into a common data model, or did you use some sort of an annotation approach whereby you could use the ontology terms to query into those distinct heterogeneous objects?
Yeah. Oh, the second one would be too clever for us. In this case, we just no, we've got a standard template that maps to our database. So the random Excel structure, we sit and we map it to a standard Excel structure, and that's also a bit of a legacy thing for us that we've worked that way in the past. and that it works for the most part, but presents a challenge when you're mapping a flat Excel table to a relational database that's fairly complex. So that's a real challenge. We're looking at tooling and how we can, so once this is kind of bootstrapped, you know, tooling of that providers can just, you know, where does our role sit in the provider's role sit, and how can we make it a bit easier with import tools? Yeah, so applying Australian standards for profile descriptions, the yellow book. Oh, this is interesting. We've just started this recently. So yeah, the observable property we've gone right is texture. That's in the collection as an observable property in the vocabularies. And then it has a little bit about the method in the description of the observable property. So when we get results in that we can tell just by looking at it that they didn't use a texture triangle, like clay, for example, is not a classifier that comes from using that texture triangle. We're like, well, should we really be using the yellow book as their property? Yeah, we don't really know. Yeah, so they just thought, yeah, we'll sort out. We're just thinking about it at the moment. Same with colour. There's the property colour. It says it uses the Munsell colour system in the description, and these are the type of results we get: grey, brown, all types, yellow, brown, greenish, whatever.
The problem you're dealing with there, Megan, is that there are two different schemes for the same attribute. So the term yellow, red, whatever, they are valid yellow book codes under one colour classification scheme. Munsell is a different colour classification scheme. Yep. Similarly, field texture is one classification scheme. Particle size distribution is a different classification scheme. And so we've got this problem that we interchangeably and for various reasons use two different schemes for what are essentially the same attributes.
Yeah. So it's just making sure we don't represent things the wrong way. You know, if they haven't used that classification, then we probably shouldn't use a term that implies that they have. Yeah. So, you know, you run into should you create, you know, you've got to put something in the procedure field with this information on. So do you create a field procedure unspecified? And there's just examples of us playing around with how we use the yellow book, apply it. Down the bottom you see we get lab-specific classification schemes as well. So we're having to get them up in our classifiers collection, which, yeah, that's interesting. Down the end, I guess, who's responsible for governing these individual classification schemes?
So Megan, if one of the use cases that we've discussed a little bit, and I can't recall if you were on some of our earlier discussions, would be something like if you were interested in finding measurements of soil bulk density and soil porosity. You know, it's like, I want to find all the people who've collected information about those two measurements, recognizing there are probably methodological differences in how they might have collected them. But it's like, okay, that's okay. I just want to find data sets where those two measurements were made in tandem. Is that a use case that you guys are addressing?
Oh, definitely. Well, we're interested in that as being, that was our kind of approach to, or the philosophy behind kind of using this information model, was that we're finding it useful in our interface as well. So a user can just search for bulk density, and then it's up to the provider, you know, whether they want to sort it by method or unit of measure. So we're hopeful that having it broken out like this, it'll be useful to the farmer, which takes a bit of work at the interface, but also useful to the scientists, useful to if we want to feed it into some Australia or global model or something down the track. But this is an interesting example actually. Poor old Simon on this call, involved in this email chain, which got a bit convoluted, was we realised, so when you're trying to measure texture, you've got different methods, different procedures, and what is it? What's the object that you're actually trying to measure? We found we needed to get a vocabulary up for the Australian standard definition of clay by grain size, but that you've also got the definition of clay as a thing as a mineral, and you've also got the definition of clay as the classifier, the result of clay, by rubbing it between your hands. So that's the Australian Yellow Book definition of clay as a classifier. So yeah, and I think that's about all I'll pain you with for now. But generally, we don't want to reinvent any wheels, and we want to recognise the priorities and the roles of all these other organisations and institutions at various levels and uses. So we can work together. And that's basically it. So, and thank you down there, particularly to CSIRO and the help with vocab and discussions, and building on soil IE work a bit as well, which you might be aware of. So. And all the farming groups. But yeah. That's all for now. Filled in an hour.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. I was
Megan.
having a
Yeah,
flashback.
I've taken up this probably 5 minutes, but yeah.
No, I was having flashbacks to some of the harmonization work that we've tried to do with the ISCN. And we've taken both the template approach that you've taken and tried the scripted approach that Mark's mentioned as well. And I don't know that either of them are actually operational for ISCN, but it's always exciting to see that the difficulties are somewhat universal.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So Megan, it sounds like a focus of your efforts there is relevant for farmers, right? So presumably you're also collecting data on crop type, crop productivity, and the relationship to the soil characteristics. Is that correct?
The first phase was from the farm group relating to soil farming group mostly. So we didn't get data coming in as much, with yield or things like that, but we did get treatment. So we're parking that a bit at the moment because we've realised, well, how do we represent treatment in the information model? So we're looking into that at the moment, and that will probably be phase 2. But yeah, I guess it's flexible enough that we can expand to things like yield and any other environmental observation relating to soil. You'd hope so. And you'd hope you'd see that application in phase 2. There's some more research work coming in from the CRC, so they'll have things like plots and treatment, and you'd imagine they won't just be measuring soil.
In your work, did you stumble across any good ontologies? I'll use the word ontologies for agricultural practice. Like rotation, tillage type, that sort of thing. Yeah.
I can't remember where I did see it exactly, but they are out there because it's a while ago I stumbled across them. We did start to want to represent or how do we capture experimental designs into phase 2 over the next couple of years. So I looked at agricultural, split plot randomised design, etc. And we have been looking at the possibility or how we may be able to adopt or adapt some parts of AgroFin from CGIAR. And they use agro-ontology mostly, I think, behind that. And they allow users to capture all those different experimental designs. So we're interested in how they do that. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I'll keep asking questions if nobody else has it. I mean, maybe this is also.
Yeah.
I don't know if Simon also needs to weigh in on whether your vocabularies have. I think, Simon, you mentioned in the chat that they're mainly SCOS. So it sounds like you're not, but you probably have. You're doing query expansion, presumably. I mean, are you developing querying interface where somebody, queries and hits on a superclass and then it expands out and captures all of the relevant subclasses and delivers that in the result set? I mean, I may be totally off with your use cases, but yeah.
Yeah, no, we are. That's kind of more an interface. So Andrew McLeod's not with us today. That's more an interface thing. At the moment, we're not really capitalising on being able to go off to SCOS and the external vocabulary and select down from there. I don't know how that would work.
Most of the vocabularies do support that.
But we've got some broader terms in our vocabulary table.
Broader and narrower.
Our vocabulary table.
Yeah, most of the vocabularies do have significant broader and narrower.
And collection. So we've got maybe 3 levels, but whether they're useful to the provider, we won't know. I think it's only like first phase now. This is only just starting to go out the pro group. Yeah.
I'm, as you can probably tell from the chat that I've been throwing in, I've been fairly heavily involved in at least designing the coding methodology, but that's not the same as the ontology or an ontology mark, because as I pointed out, largely we're using SCOS for what it was designed for, which is taking existing sort of paper-based vocabularies with some limited hierarchies and very weak axiomatization when it comes down to it, and just giving them URIs and getting them online. Now, giving them URIs is a good start, because then we can potentially generate or produce other representations of the things denoted by those URIs, which have got a lot more semantics in them later on. Okay, so and we're sort of taking the handbooks which have got these codes in them as being the driver for all of this. So those codes are the things which are used by the practitioners. So those codes, in almost all cases, they warrant having a URI. Now then, what you get when you dereference that URI, for the moment it's SCOS. Okay, but later on it could be something richer, and so
Gotcha.
so that's the kind of strategy we're using. The handbooks are good. They've been, and where I refer to Andrew Biggs, who's on the call, who's involved in the revisions here. I'm not a domain expert, so I wouldn't know. But we're taking, the starting assumption is that the handbooks are well thought through and are the reflection of the domain expertise. And so then it's just a matter of lifting that gradually to make it so that it can work in a more networked context. At the same time, I'm also fairly heavily involved at the moment with QUDT. And QUDT is a bit of a hybrid. Essentially it's an ABOX ontology mark. There's hundreds of entries in there. They're all individual members of the classes defined in the QUDT ontology. QUDT ontology is just a little fella. That's the T-box ontology. But none of these things are perfect. We're starting from where we are and building up from there. And You know, my judgment is the QUDT process and governance at the moment is something which is which we can work with. We can get things added. I put a bit of work into getting the UCOM codes in. We're also getting all of the NERC vocabulary service units of measure put over, essentially mirrored over in QUDT. So there's essentially a pull request for about another 150 units of measure in there at the moment, which are the ones that aren't in QUDT but are in the NERC vocabulary service. So, you know, we've got a bit of a harmonization agenda here, Mark. And it's not to say that any of these things should be unique and will be the only source that you ever use. But if we have just enough cross references, you know, the NERC ones all point to the QUDT equivalents these days, and the QUDT ones have got all the UCOM codes in there. So we've at least knitted those ones together now.
So QUDT would have something like millimoles of oxygen per liter.
Well, it wouldn't go to oxygen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Wouldn't have substances, Mark. Mass concentration, you know, or amount of substance concentration, or you know, and those, but it wouldn't go to substances at all. No.
Gotcha. Great.
Let us go.
Yeah, thanks, Mum.
Well, I think we're at the top of the hour,
Hey,
so I
good
wanted
to see
to.
Andrew Biggs in there. Yeah. And shout out to Andrew there with all his work in governance of the Yellow Book. I can't see the roll call. Hi.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick comment I wanted to make about this, and Australia is probably a good place to have this conversation. I don't know whether the Soil CRC, which is funding your work, is having this conversation, but you can count on one hand the number of soil laboratories in Australia, and that includes the government ones. The Queensland Laboratory is probably one of the biggest. We could solve a lot of this problem if the laboratories exported their data in a consistent manner. Why don't we just solve this problem at the root? The Green Book has been around for 25 years, 20 years or something. Certainly most government laboratories use the Green Book method codes to code the data up as they export it to the client. If we could get the private laboratories, all 2 or 3 of them in existence in Australia, to do the same thing, problem solved.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
The lament of data harmonizations all over the world.
I know. I mean, it doesn't solve the issues here for you straight up, but just from a national perspective, given that Megan's work is funded through the CRC for whatever it's called, high performance soils or something or other, I do wonder whether the program, the CRC, is missing the real target audience. The real target audience is the laboratories producing the data.
Yeah.
And that they should be in the conversation.
I guess we need to, we'll be speaking to, you know, governance of the Green Book as well. I guess I don't really know about the, there is a soil chemistry national group. I'd say Bruce Shelley is on that. I'm not sure of the status of that. So perhaps that's the group to push that conversation through. But yeah.
But Andrew makes a very good point there, which is, you know, the challenge in getting these things propagated is as much a social and business one as it is a technical, you know, ontologist or anything. So, you know, getting the critical mass means solving some business problems for someone somewhere.
Yeah.
And it'd make life very easy for everyone, wouldn't it?
Well, I know that I've heard from the research communities a request for standardized template development or recommendations for best practices for making their data more useful down the road. So there is an interest in the data provider side of, hey, what do you want me to measure to have my data reusable to do X? So I think there is a role for us as data in a data harmonization effort to make that pitch. I think you muted, Mark.
I think Mark is talking.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Well, I think we're getting people dropping off we're past the top of the hour. Thank you all for a fantastic inaugural ESIP cluster call. It was a great presentation, Megan. And I will see everybody in 2 weeks. Same time.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.